Welcome to Economy Originals, original stories of founders, brands, and global business power.
There is a factory in Navarra in northern Spain that used to hum. For decades, it churned out refrigerators and dishwashers. It employed more than 600 people. It was the kind of place that sustained a town. School fees paid, mortgages serviced, summers on the coast. Then it went quiet. The German company that owned it shut it down. It had been losing market share, not to a local competitor, not to another European brand, but to factories thousands of miles away, factories sitting in China. Someone left a message on the wall before they turned off the lights for the last time. Worker fired, hang the boss. But here is the part of the story that nobody expected. The factory is not dead. It has been given a second chance. Because the company that has now committed to build on that exact site, to bring jobs back to Navarra, to restart the machines, is Chinese. A battery manufacturer called Lithium, the world's second largest producer of energy storage technology, is planning a 400 million euro facility, 700 new jobs. The country that killed the factory may be the one that saves it. Spain's prime minister has met China's president 4 times in just over 3 years. The latest visit to Beijing was not a coincidence. It was a strategy. Because Spain has made a calculated bet that the future of its industrial base depends, at least in part, on Chinese capital, Chinese technology, and Chinese manufacturing know-how. And that bet is making the rest of Europe deeply uncomfortable. Because while Spain is embracing the dragon, Brussels is trying to build a cage around it. And while Europe argues with itself, Latin America is already opening its doors wide. Argentina is negotiating lithium. Brazil is selling soy. Chile is selling copper. And Chinese electric vehicles are arriving in Buenos Aires showrooms that, until last year, had never seen a car without an exhaust pipe. The world is dividing into 2 camps. It is not East versus West, not democracy versus authoritarianism. We're witnessing something more complicated, more interesting, and far more dangerous to many. A world where everyone needs China, and nobody quite trusts it. And at the center of it all, the factory in Navarra, the lithium fields of Patagonia, the battery plants of Hungary, the soy ports of Santos, stands one man with one very long plan. A plan he built over decades, carefully considering every move, every offer, and every shift in the global order. To understand what China is doing in Europe and Latin America today, you have to understand what China decided about itself 30 years ago. For most of the 20th century, China was the world's factory floor. It made things cheaply. It exported relentlessly. It grew at a speed the world had never seen. But it was always, at its core, dependent. Dependent on Western technology. Dependent on foreign capital. Dependent on other countries buying what it made. When Xi Jinping consolidated power, he looked at that dependency and decided it was the single greatest threat to China's future. What he did was not isolate China, but something far more ambitious. He would make the rest of the world dependent on China instead. In 2013, China launched what it called the Belt and Road Initiative.
The belt connects the land, the road moves on the sea. The promise that they hold is joint prosperity. We're breaking barriers, we're making history. The war we're dreaming of starts with you and me. The future's coming now. The belt and road is how we share the progress now. The belt and road is how.
trillion in global infrastructure investment. Ports, railways, power plants, fiber optic cables, all of it stretching from Southeast Asia to East Africa, from the Middle East to the very edges of Europe. On paper, a development program. In practice, a network of dependencies built one contract at a time. But the Belt and Road was only the beginning, because Xi understood something that most Western economists were slow to recognize, that the next great industrial revolution would not be powered by oil. It would be powered by batteries, and whoever had them had a winning hand. China made a decision in the early 2000s that would reshape the entire global economy 2 decades later.
2020年，全面建成小康社会，取得伟大历史性成就，决战脱贫攻坚，取得决定性胜利。
It would dominate the industries of the future before the future arrived. Solar cells, lithium batteries, electric vehicles. What Chinese economists call Jingsan-yang, the new three. These are the industries that replaced textiles, furniture, and appliances and become, step by step, the engine of Chinese growth. By 2023, China controlled more than 3/4 of the world's battery production capacity. It was responsible for more than half of all electric vehicle sales globally. It had become the world's largest exporter of cars, surpassing Japan, surpassing Germany, surpassing the United States. And it did this not by accident. It happened by design. And then Xi Jinping made a promise to the world. China would peak its carbon emissions before 2030. It would reach carbon neutrality by 2060.
China has taken an active part in global environmental governance. China takes seriously its obligations under environment-related treaties, including on climate change and biodiversity. We have hit ahead of schedule the targets set for 2020 for tackling climate change. Guided by the vision of building a community with a shared future for mankind, China will continue to make extraordinary efforts to scale up its nationally determined contributions. China will adopt even more forceful policies and measures and strive to keep carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Thus making greater efforts and contributions towards meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
A green revolution, he called it. Critics called it contradictory. Analysts called it ambitious. Rivals called it strategic. And all three were right. Because Xi's green revolution was not just about the climate, but about leverage. If the whole world needs to transition to clean energy, and it does, and China controls the technology, the batteries, and the supply chains to make that transition possible, then China controls the transition itself. This is Xi Jinping's gambit. Not conquest or confrontation, indispensability. Make yourself so embedded in the global economy that decoupling becomes more painful than dependence. And then, from that position of structural power, reshape the rules of the game. But Xi Jinping did not build this position alone.
China.
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 He had help from the one country that, for 80 years, had been the guarantor of the global economic order it was now dismantling from the inside. When the United States began treating its own allies as trade adversaries, imposing tariffs without warning,
They're manipulating their currency today as an offset against the tariffs.
renegotiating agreements without notice, making the rules of global commerce feel arbitrary and unstable, it created something Xi had been waiting for, a vacuum. We're not talking about a military vacuum or a political one. It created something worse for the US and better for China, an economic vacuum. Thanks to that, Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe reached nearly $12 billion in 2025, triple the figure recorded just 3 years earlier. In Latin America, China participated in more than 268 infrastructure projects between 2005 and 2023, worth over $112 billion. These are not abstract numbers. They are ports and railways, power plants and data centers, battery factories and solar arrays. They are the physical architecture of a new dependency, one that was built quietly, contract by contract, while the West was distracted by its own internal arguments. And here is where the story gets complicated, because Europe is not one entity. It never has been. The director of Invest in Navarra, the regional agency that spent more than 2 years trying to convince lithium to build its battery factory there, said something that cuts to the heart of Europe's dilemma. He pointed out that lithium had opened a battery plant in Dallas, Texas, designed to benefit from Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Then Donald Trump repealed part of that act. And suddenly, Chinese companies started looking back at Europe. Lithium was not alone. Dozens of Chinese manufacturers recalculated their American bets overnight. The story of Chinese investment in Europe is a matter of fractures. Hungary, under Viktor Orban, became China's preferred gateway into the European Union.
China and Hungary have always been good friends with mutual trust and support and good partners in win-win cooperation. And it is natural for our two countries to further lift the level of bilateral ties and enrich bilateral cooperation.
Championing Beijing's interests, staying silent on supply chain risks, welcoming factory after factory. Spain positioned itself as open and pragmatic, arguing, as its industry minister told the Financial Times, that a country capable of talking to everyone is less vulnerable than one that closes its doors. Meanwhile, France and Germany pushed Brussels towards a harder line. After months of heated internal debate, the European Commission responded with what it called a Made in Europe strategy. The logic was elegant in its irony. Europe would impose on Chinese companies the same conditions that China imposed on Western companies for decades when American and European manufacturers wanted access to the Chinese market. This meant transferring technology, training local workers, and buying local components. Play by our rules if you want to play in our market. To put the stakes plainly, China's trade policy is in fact part of its national security strategy. Those Chinese factories, even the ones built on European soil, ultimately answer to Beijing. And an accumulation of factories that answer to Beijing represents an accumulation of leverage. The question Europe cannot answer cleanly is this: is a Chinese factory on European soil a gift or a Trojan horse? Is it 700 jobs or 700 hostages to Beijing's goodwill? Even Macron, who has pushed hardest for European strategic autonomy, wrote that the EU must stay open for China to invest in sectors where it is a leader, provided the Chinese help generate employment and innovation and shared technology. Listen to it again, provided. Because Beijing's explicit goal, stated openly by Xi Jinping, is to foster foreign dependence on China's advanced manufacturing, not technology transfer, dependency. Europe is trying to hold two contradictory positions simultaneously. It needs China's technology to survive the green transition, but fears China's technology as an instrument of control. Both things are true, and the clock is running. "10,000 kilometers from Navarra, the conversation looks completely different. In Argentina, the question is not whether to trust China. The question is whether Argentina can afford not to. Beneath the high Andean plateau that stretches across Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile lies the largest concentration of lithium reserves on Earth, the mineral that makes the batteries that power the electric vehicles that China manufactures and sells to the world. China needs it in almost infinite quantities, and Argentina has it. In late 2024, BYD, the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer, made a quiet visit to Argentina, not just to sell cars, but to explore something larger: lithium mining, solar energy, and the possibility of local production. Xi Jinping, who met China's President Milei at the G20 summit, understood perfectly what Argentina has to offer and what China can offer in return: investment, technology, and the one thing Argentina has been desperately short of for decades: capital. This is the transaction at the heart of China's Latin American strategy: resources in exchange for investment, raw materials in exchange for infrastructure, the Global South's wealth in the ground in exchange for China's wealth in technology and capital. 2 decades ago, trade between China and Latin America was worth $14 billion a year. By 2022, it had reached nearly $500 billion. China is now the primary trading partner of Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina, displacing the United States, displacing the European Union, displacing decades of economic geography. But look carefully at what moves in each direction. 95% of Latin American exports to China are raw materials. 3 products, soy, copper, and crude oil, make up 70% of everything the region sends east. And 5 countries, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Ecuador, account for 90% of those exports. Latin American scholars have a word for this pattern. They have had it for 50 years: dependency. The region exports raw materials. It imports manufactured goods. It sells cheap and buys expensive. And the industrial capacity that would allow it to escape that cycle never quite arrives. But this time, something is different. China is not just buying. China is arriving. Since 2021, what researchers call new infrastructure, electric vehicles, renewable energy, 5G, data centers, has represented 58% of Chinese investment in Latin America. China is no longer just the buyer of last resort for Latin American raw materials. It is becoming the builder of Latin America's industrial future. 2 camps of Latin American economists have been arguing about this for 20 years. One sees China as a new form of the old dependency, a rich power extracting resources from a poorer region, preventing industrialization, keeping Latin America perpetually on the periphery. The other sees something different: a partner with capital and technology that the West has consistently failed to provide, an alternative to a United States that has spent decades treating Latin America as a backyard rather than a partner. Both camps are watching the same evidence and reaching opposite conclusions. The honest answer is, both are right. The question is not whether China offers something valuable. It does. The question is what China wants in return, and whether Latin America, with its institutional fragility, its political volatility, its desperate need for investment, is in any position to negotiate the terms. There is a version of this story in which China is a predator, deliberately creating debt traps, deliberately fostering dependency, deliberately using trade as a weapon of geopolitical coercion. There is another version in which China is simply an extremely capable state pursuing its national interests, the same way every major power in history has done. The truth is probably somewhere between the two, but here's what is not in dispute. China invested the equivalent of $1.6 trillion in clean energy in 2023 alone, 30% more than the previous year. It put into service more solar photovoltaic capacity in that single year than the rest of the world combined installed in 2022. Its electric vehicle exports grew 30% annually, and its clean energy industries, the new 3, generated over $147 billion in combined exports. These are not the numbers of a country improvising. These are the numbers of a country executing a plan it has been working on for 20 years. Xi Jinping does not talk like an empire builder. He talks about mutual benefit, about South-South cooperation, about a shared future for humanity. And there is a genuine substance in that language. China really has built infrastructure that no one else was building. It really has invested in places that Western capital had abandoned. It really has offered financing to governments that couldn't access it elsewhere. But Xi is also explicit, almost startlingly so, about the strategic logic underneath the generosity. He has said openly that his goal is to foster foreign dependence on China's advanced manufacturing, not as a byproduct, as an objective. The architecture of what China is building is not an alliance. Alliances require reciprocity. They require shared values. They require the possibility of saying no. What China is building is a system of structured interdependence, where the cost of defying Beijing gradually becomes higher than the cost of accommodating it. One factory at a time, one battery contract at a time, one lithium agreement at a time. This is not the Belt and Road of a decade ago. Massive dams, enormous railways, spectacular projects that sometimes came with unsustainable debt attached. Xi has learned from those mistakes. The new philosophy is what Chinese officials themselves call small and beautiful. Smaller investments, shorter timelines, mixed public-private financing, harder to refuse, easier to embed, deeper in the system, and more difficult to reverse. Europe and Latin America are both gambling on China, but they are gambling differently. Europe is trying to get the technology transfer without the dependency. It wants China's batteries, China's solar panels, China's electric vehicles, but it wants them built on European soil, by European workers, with European intellectual property gradually accumulating. It wants the dragon's fire without the dragon's loyalty to another master. Latin America is trying to get the investment without the extraction. It wants Chinese capital to build the infrastructure its own governments cannot afford. But it wants the jobs, the technology transfer, the industrial capacity that would finally allow it to stop selling raw materials at the bottom of the value chain and start manufacturing at the top. Both bets are reasonable and risky, and both bets depend on a variable that neither Europe nor Latin America controls. What does China actually want in the long run? Xi Jinping is playing a game with a longer time horizon than any democratic leader can match. His political cycle is not 4 years. His political cycle is, in his own words, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, a project measured in decades, perhaps in generations. He is optimizing for 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic, the year by which he wants China to be, unambiguously, the world's leading power. Back in Navarra, the people who lost their jobs at the BSH factory are not thinking about geopolitics. They are thinking about mortgages, school fees, summers they cannot afford. If a Chinese company brings those 700 jobs back, does it matter where the capital comes from? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that Spain and Europe and Latin America are all trying to answer at the same time. And the answer will shape the global economy for the next 50 years. Because here's the thing about a gamble. You don't always get to choose whether to play. Sometimes the game finds you. A factory closes. An investor arrives. A deal is offered. And the only real choice is whether you negotiate from knowledge or from desperation. China did not create the vacuum that Trump's America left behind, but China was ready for it, more ready than anyone else. And while Europe argues about how to respond, and Latin America argues about what to demand in return, the contracts are being signed. The factories are being planned. The batteries are being built. One piece at a time. One factory at a time. One piece of the future at a time. The dragon's gambit is already in motion. The question is not whether to respond. The question is whether the response comes before or after. Checkmate. The dragon's gambit.